Hey everyone, this is your host, Andrew Holland. Thank you so much for listening to the Andrew Holland podcast each and every week, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. As an entrepreneur who's been through a lot of highs and a lot of lows, I started this podcast to be a source of weekly motivation, inspiration, and support for all of us who are working to achieve something meaningful. And as importantly, so that none of us ever have to feel alone or isolated while we're doing so. Together, we explore the stories of successful people, we get insight and advice from individuals who have accomplished amazing things. We discuss practical and fascinating business models and strategies, and we dive deep into understanding ourselves as human beings. So please, help me grow our group and subscribe to the show on your favorite audio platform. Subscribe to, watch, and thumbs up our episodes on our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast. Follow and interact with me on Twitter and Threads. My handle is A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast. That's probably my favorite part of the whole podcast is the interaction I get with our guests and with you as our listeners. Lastly, if you enjoy the show and you want to support what we're working to accomplish, please share our show with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues at work. This show is nothing without you and your support, and I'm so incredibly thankful for each and every one of you listening, watching, and sharing the podcast every single week. Now it's time to get our motivation, inspiration, and support for this week and jump into today's episode. In today's episode, I share part 2 of my conversation with Akshay Nanavati. As you can recall, he is the founder of Fearvana and a former Marine, and he fully embraces and espouses this concept of marrying fear and nirvana and using negative emotions, quote unquote. He doesn't believe there's any bad emotions. He believes there's just emotions, and embracing that adversity and struggle to find true happiness and fulfillment. Today, we talk about, in more detail, his expedition of going across Antarctica, hiking over 1,700 miles, over 110 days, all by himself, something that's never been accomplished. We talk about why he's doing it and what purpose or meaning he's hoping to find. And we talk about, or he gives his advice based on all the different experiences that he's had, what he recommends for those who are feeling lost or stuck in the monotony of day-to-day life, and gives us his real concrete 3-part concept of fear, stillness, and social connections. Part 2 of my conversation is just as invigorating as part 1 of our conversation, and he gives us a lot of insight into his mindset and what he's working to accomplish through his Antarctica trek, and he's training very hard for it, is a very part of really living that concept of embracing adversity and struggle and finding peace in the depth of some very hard, challenging journeys that he's going on. I really enjoyed the conversation with Akshay, and I think you'll get a lot of self-help concepts that will motivate you to fulfill whatever your Antarctica journey. That's what it is for Akshay, and it can be something completely different for you. I think it will start getting your mind thinking about what is your Antarctica, where you can take that next step of personal growth. So enjoy this second conversation, or part 2 of my conversation with Akshay. I know I did.
While Andrew Holland is a CPA, a real estate broker, and involved in multiple businesses, including some investment companies, the Andrew Holland podcast is for informational purposes only. All of Andrew's views and those of his guests are solely their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of any of the businesses or companies Andrew or his guests are affiliated with. You should not treat any advice, conversation, business recommendation, investment recommendation, or anything of the like as a specific inducement to make a specific business decision, take a specific action, make a particular investment, or follow a specific business or investment strategy. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show.
Talk to us about Antarctica. You are doing something that no humankind has ever done. Before we jumped on this podcast, I watched the video that you must have just recently released, and it's fantastic, by the way, asking for support and donations for what you're trying to do. And for those of you that are interested, fearvana.com, you can click on Antarctica and you'll see a nice 8-minute video where you actually talk about what you're trying to accomplish, what man has accomplished going to the moon, some of the other great adventures going across the Atlantic Ocean when everybody thought it couldn't be done. When you've done a lot of things, but this is going to be, thus to this point, really the pinnacle of your Fearvana experience.
Mhm.
First off, describe to us, for those who haven't heard or don't know what you're doing and haven't had a chance to go to the website yet, what are you seeking to do over what time frame, and why is it so meaningful?
This November, so November 2024, I will be attempting to do a solo 110-day, 1,700-mile coast-to-coast ski crossing of the entire continent of Antarctica, starting on one end, going to the South Pole, and going to the other end. Doing a full coast-to-coast crossing without kites or dogs has never been accomplished. So I'll be just hauling 400 pounds worth of gear, my food, my fuel, my supplies in a sled to make this 110 day journey completely alone. One of the most hostile, unforgiving environments of the planet. I've lost 2 fingers to frostbite from Antarctica already. And I was out there 2
Wow.
years ago. Yeah, so it is, we're talking minus 40-degree temperatures, hurricane force winds. It's savage, it's unforgiving, and I'll be completely alone. For portions of the journey, I'll be geographically the most isolated life form on Earth. That is the mission.
And why do you want to do this?
Why? Yeah. When you're out there, like part one on the most shallow level, there is something sort of drawing about pushing the very boundaries of human endurance in a way that has never been pushed before, right? To do something no human being has ever done. Because when you do that, it's like the 4-minute mile. It stretches the human capacity through one story. We're story-driven creatures. It expands human consciousness and our ability to do more through that. So attempting something like that is inherently, to me, it's worth pursuing because it expands human consciousness. Which leads me then at the meta level. I believe there's kind of meta level. There should be both a selfish and a selfless motivation to any big goal. So selfishly, for me, it's awakening my own inner Buddhahood. It's touching into the hand of God. It's like, when you're out there in the depths of solitude, in the depths of suffering, you are digging into the depths of the human soul, opening doors into the soul that are so very rarely opened. And the treasures you unearth out there, they are profoundly beautiful. In that silence, you really start to hear. As I even said earlier, like the volume of life is dialed out there at a max intensity. So the highs are so high and the lows are so intensely low. But all of that experience, in this one microcosm of time, you get to feel lifetimes worth of the human experience. And it is to me, to be able to transcend the amount of suffering and solitude I'll experience, to keep moving forward. That self-transcendence is awakening my own inner divinity. It's awakening my own inner Buddhahood. I want to go there. I want to, the bigger the dragon, the bigger the treasure. So I want to battle a monster dragon to unearth a tremendous treasure of the human soul and see what I find in my own self-discovery, in this constant eternal quest I have to tap deeper into the human spirit, right? And selflessly, for me, it's to then go bring that wisdom back from the edge and help others who are suffering. Because I get to, and I say this word very intentionally, I get to play on such edges. As I mentioned earlier, I have a privilege to choose my own suffering, right? But because I get to go so far out of the edge, so far into the depths of solitude and suffering, I get to open new doors that aren't otherwise opened in the normal world. And the wisdom that I unearth from those experiences, the treasures I find on the other side of those doors, it is truly for me a responsibility to then bring it back to help others who are suffering, which is what has me speak on podcasts like this or speak on stages that I speak on, because it gives me access to the wisdom and I'm simply a messenger for it. As we mentioned earlier, my vehicle drove over a bomb in Iraq. It didn't explode. My friends exploded. So to me, I truly believe I have a debt I owe for this life I've been gifted. Like I was born, to good parents just because of where I was born, as opposed to the woman I worked with who was born and sent into sex trafficking, or the former child soldiers or people in war. I was blessed with 1,000, 1,000,000 times more opportunities than most on earth. And I didn't do anything to earn that. So my paradigm, and I'm not saying that everybody should adopt this paradigm, I'm saying this works for me, is that I believe I have a debt to owe for this life. And I pay off that debt by bringing the wisdom back from the edges through the depths of suffering I get to experience, and using it to be of service to humanity. So, and I will touch on that part too, is that like a lot of people have told me they don't sort of resonate with that idea of a debt, and I've even had people say it's unhealthy. And look, the point is to not say you have to adopt my frame as my frame. If you take the lesson from that, it's that we all gone through hard things in life. You take your hard thing and find a frame that serves you, right? So this serves me. It's a tremendously valuable place to go. It fuels me. It drives me. It works for me. And so
you're using it as motivation, and I think that's an incredibly healthy way.
Exactly.
For you, you, and you know
Exactly.
what you need for motivation. And I think a lot of people who would say it doesn't resonate.
And that's okay. It doesn't have to. I'm not like,
right.
yeah, you don't, and I could not make that clear. And I highlight this because I've had even like mental health professionals be like, that's unhealthy. And I'm like, I get that you think that, and that's cool if that doesn't work for you. And for anybody listening, if it doesn't resonate, that's cool. The point is, find your own flavor of whatever darkness you've experienced and turn that into fuel. So for me, that's why I mean, even the book Fearvana, I don't make $1 off it. All the profits we've donated to charity. It's about using the being simply a messenger for these places I get to go, the wisdom I get to experience, and sharing these, call it the voice of God that speaks, like I said, I'm in the darkness, and in these silence, these moments of pure silence, I hear things that I don't otherwise hear. And you get to really hear in silence. You get to really hear. And that's what you hear is call it what you want. The universe, consciousness, God. It's beautiful.
So a couple thoughts on that. Yeah, I mean, mental health professionals who say it's not healthy, I don't have a lot to say about mental health professionals, because I think most of them are mental and they don't really have a clue about most of humanity. But I love that you're finding what's your motivation, and everybody has to find what motivation works for them.
Exactly.
One of the things that seems a bit quizzical to me is, I asked you earlier if you believe in God,
Mm-hmm.
and you said, I can't say you said no, but it sounds like in a lot of these experiences, you are, like, for lack of a better word, talking with God, like knowing. And again, I cast no bones. I believe everybody knows that there's a God, and they say, a lot of atheists, when they face death, they pray. Well, if you don't think there's a God, and not to belabor this issue, but to me, what you're experiencing is the very essence of getting to see what God has given us, and really soul searching, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's where you're experiencing the very fact that there is a higher being, that God exists.
Yeah, no, great question. So I guess to drill into that a little deeper, to explain that, I don't ascribe to the conventional, and this is not again a right wrong, the religious paradigms on God, and as a sort of higher being sitting in the sky, if you will, and the one who's a kind of puppet master that guides our lives. Because, and this is just my take, I've seen a lot of evil in the world, a lot, and I do believe that there's things in the world that are not governed by a being, a force choosing reality, like choosing how good and bad happens. There's a lot of dark that happens, and there's no reason, if there was somebody controlling it, so let's say, for that thing to happen. And I think the greatest actually explanation of it is in the book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. Harold Kushner did a fantastic job describing it. And to him, like, one of the lines he says is, to me, the surest proof of the existence of God is that when people pray for strength, hope, and courage, they find a level of strength, hope, and courage they didn't have otherwise. So it's not like, I do believe there's random shit that happens in the world. There's dark that happens in the world. There's evil. No God can prevent that, in my take on it, because otherwise, why hasn't it been prevented? But God gives us the ability to fight back against that evil. And I don't know if it's like, when with those voices I'm hearing, it's like what it is, whether it's a force, whether it's within myself, whether it's some deeper soul of the earth speaking to me. It's as clear as me and you having this conversation when I'm in the silence and I get to hear that. So it's very real to me, and that's my own experience of it. And it allows me to be a better version of myself, to bring more value to our human family. But it's not a paradigm or a construct of what conventionally is ascribed to as God in many religious doctrines, is my take on it, if that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, and a couple points. and then I have some more questions about Antarctica specifically. The fact there is evil in this world, there's no question about it. And I would say that, the fact that there's evil doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It means that
I agree. And
there is a lot of evilness in man, and, we certainly go our own ways. And he lets it happen a lot of times. And we could have a long conversation about that. What is also true is a lot of people have used conventional religion for a lot of evil,
justify
and so and that continues to happen. And so I think that's again the depravity of man trying to manipulate something to their own benefit and will when it shouldn't be used in such a manner. Which I would argue is almost one of the perhaps most evil things you can do, is pretending to use God for your evil will.
I would agree.
But anyway, so going back to Antarctica, what happens if you die?
I mean, so one thing to clarify too is Antarctica is, usually when I hear this, people kind of think immediately of sort of Alex Honnold's Free Solo or something like that. It's not nearly as dangerous as free soloing or even mountaineering. To me, it's a lot more suffering than any other outdoor sport I've pursued, but it's not nearly as dangerous.
But you could freeze to death. Like you could, I mean, -40. Yeah, you've already lost 2 fingers. Like you can die out there. You know this, obviously.
There's not no risk, but it is like, I mean, I've trained enough in the cold that, like, if things get horrific, if I break a limb out there, I set up my tent. Like 90% of the journey, an evacuation is possible. Even when I got frostbite, there was It's not dangerous, but it's not as dangerous as people think. Like, because for example, in mountaineering, when you're climbing up a mountain, you could fall off the mountain. You're going up vertical faces.
It's over at that point.
And I've done a lot of mountaineering. I was on Denali 2 years ago, and you're on a thin ridge line. With such a thin ridge line, there's 1,000-foot drop on each side of you, right? So that you could fall, and literally that's going to kill you. In Antarctica, you're walking on essentially flat. It's not entirely flat because the South Pole is at 9,500 feet, so you're climbing, but essentially flat-ish terrain for an entire 1,700 miles. So the draw to me on polar travel, like one polar explorer from the 1900s put it beautifully when he said, polar exploration is at once the cleanest and most isolated way of having a bad time, which has been devised. So to me, and it could not be more true. Like, I've experienced every outdoor sport you can think of. And in terms of at least voluntary suffering, I've never experienced a game that has more voluntary suffering than polar travel. So to me, the draw is not the suffering in and of itself. It's what the suffering gives you access to. And that to me is self-transcendence. Suffering is a training ground for self-transcendence, and self-transcendence is, coming back to what we said, is touching the hand of God, because you are rising above the limitations of this self in order to tap into something that allows you to keep moving forward when everything in you thinks you can't. And that, like, I mean, just imagine the monotony, right? There's no stimuli to engage you. So flat, white nothingness. There's no trees. There's no mountains for most of the journey. Part of Antarctica does have mountains, but most of the journey, flat, white nothingness. And you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again with incredible struggle in incredible hostile environments, and you're completely alone. Whereas in mountaineering, for example, as you go up and down the mountain, the views change. The day changes. The nature of the terrain each day is different. So it's dynamic. It's more variety. It's more stimuli, as is life. In Antarctica, every day is the same. And every day, there's no easy days in Antarctica. There's just less hard days, as we like to say, So that is the draw, is the mental, spiritual, and physical hardship and the doors that those open into the human spirit.
Well, and I'm so excited for you to do it. I have no doubt you'll accomplish it, and to bring back what you're going to learn from it. What is the worst, given, you've been training for this, what is the worst part? Is it the cold? Is it the physical exertion? Is it the nothingness? What's the actual, not to dwell on the bad things, but since we're talking about dwelling in the adversity, I want to know, given your experience, like, what's the worst part about it?
The hardest part is the mental challenge when you are dragging a sled for, let's say, 12 hours a day, which I'll have to do out there. And even when I'm training here in Alaska, right? I have a very heavy sled, and every step is work. And you're out there, like in my training, for 6-7 hours or whatever. And I've done many of these expeditions. And your mind has both the burden and the luxury to wander. And that's the daunting nature. When you're in mountaineering, for example, I often compare it to, because that's where you kind of compare it to, because both are similar in the cold and that kind of thing. But in mountaineering, the environment it doesn't force you, but it makes it a lot easier for a mind to be present and the mind to shut off. Because like if I'm on a thin ridge line and there's 1,000-foot drop on each side, I'm not thinking about things. My mind is right there, right?
Yeah, you're paying attention.
Exactly. The mind makes the environment makes it a lot easier to get into flow and put yourself in the here and now, because there's consequences if you don't. In Antarctica, when you're just skiing in nothingness, it doesn't do that. So you have to do that. You have to make yourself more into the here and now, put yourself in flow. And that dance is incredibly hard. And that's part of the draw, is that's what to me is the ability to navigate that. Because I've had times on polar expeditions where 10 minutes can feel like hours, man. And you're just like, this sucks. And you look at your watch and it's only been like 10 minutes because it's so much work. You know, like I was in minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit the other day, dragging incredibly heavy sweat and sweating through that just in one layer. I was wearing one thin layer and a parka, and I was still sweating because of how much work it was at minus 10 degrees. So you're doing that, and every step is work, and your mind wanders. So your mind can think all kinds of places. It'll take you to every place you can possibly imagine, places you can't even imagine.
That's the thing, you know, I'm shaking my head, but truth be told, like I can't even fathom, because I've never experienced it, I can't even fathom, but I've certainly had periods where your mind can go to so many different places, but not to the level you're talking about. So it suddenly makes my, when I whine about getting up and having to go to the gym seem pretty minuscule. So I appreciate you giving me that motivation.
That is helpful, brother. That's like the biggest teaching I would say for anybody listening is from all these experiences. I would say if there's one thing to do is spend more time in silence and stillness, because that'll allow you to open those doors within yourself that haven't been opened. And Carl Jung he put it beautifully when he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Until you make the unconscious conscious. And you do that through being still to open those doors and to make the unconscious conscious. And he also said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that's how you do it, being still, being silent. You don't have to go to the depths of Antarctica to do it.
So that's what I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you, you're taking it to the extremes.
Absolutely.
But not everybody either has the luxury to do that or can do that or wants to do that.
Yeah.
So what do you recommend people, let's say they're sitting at home, they're in a life of monotony, they're not feeling particularly useful, maybe they're not to the point where they're ready to kill themselves, but they're just kind of, they're living dead, for lack of a better term. You get up, do the same thing, blah, 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 go to bed, get up, do the same thing, yada, yada, yada. And again, I'm a big believer. I think most of everything on this earth is meaningless without faith, without spirituality. But let's focus on what you've experienced. Like, what would you say to them to get out of that? What specific actions can they take today, be it as small as they need to be or as large as they need to be, to experience what you've just described without going to the extremes that you're going to?
Yeah. I mean, for starters, why does that happen? Essentially, so I don't want to go out there, so I'll stay in this discomfort, right? So that's what has people stay in a misery, even if it's not great, right? So because the unknown is scary. So step one is there's nothing I can say or you can say or somebody can read or listen to that's going to make that less scary or make that easy. That you're going to have to go through the suck of that. That is a given. If you're trying to, one of the greatest problems in our inability to change is looking for the easiest, quickest way out. We're constantly looking for the easiest, quickest, and I get it. It's normal to do that because doing the hard thing sucks. It's hard. Like, I'll give you a very concrete example. I was working with a woman who had PTSD from the Boston bombing, and we were talking about it, and she was like, and so I said, next time you feel some hypervigilance with a loud noise, I want you to just pause and be with that. And she goes, yeah, but that's really hard. And I go, I know it's hard, but there's only way out is through. And I get it. It's not to demonize, fault this woman. It does suck. So you got to be with that. So now, with that said, if you want to get out of a rut, if you want to get out of the same thing that you're doing, you have to do something you've never done before to get something you've never had before, to go somewhere you've never been before. So that inherently is going to be scary. The nature of risk, when you do something you've never done, it's risky, it's scary. And I don't even mean risk of life. It's risk of entering new terrain, risk within and without. So there's fear. So to normalize everything we've been talking about from the start is not demonizing when the fear shows up. I cannot stress this enough. So God, all right, I'm going to do something scary. And I'll give you specific actions I think to do. But when you hear it, you're probably going to be like, that's scary. Instead of trying to resist the fear, demonize the fear, resist the anxiety, pause, acknowledge it. I'm feeling some fear around this, and that's okay. That's step one, is not demonizing the emotion. Neuroscience has even shown that when you label an emotion, like saying, I feel fear, it reduces activity in the limbic brain and the emotional brain and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain related to focus and awareness. So essentially what it's doing is creating a space between the emotion and you as the feeler of that emotion, so you can respond to it instead of reacting to it, right? So don't demonize the emotion, pause, be with it, acknowledge it, write it down, label it, even engage it. Like when I feel fear, especially even writing a book on fear, I was terrified. What if people judge me? What if people think it's stupid? What if people think I'm stupid? So I wrote down, what am I scared of? Why am I scared? What's the worst case scenario? And when you engage it, fear propels you to prepare. So now you can prepare for that worst case scenario. So that's kind of a mindset piece around not demonizing whatever shows up around it, the fear, stress, anxiety, which you almost certainly will feel, because
That's great advice.
of doing something new. So, embrace, acknowledge, accept the isness of that emotion. Now, what can you practically do? I would say for starters, kind of what I was just kind of talking about is be still. Lock yourself in a dark closet for half an hour. Go dark, sit with it. And I can't tell you, like, and if that scares you, good. It should scare you. If that's uncomfortable, good. It will be uncomfortable. But it'll allow you to find something within yourself that you haven't found before. If half an hour feels too easy, go for an hour. I had one kid who, after chatting with me, he went and did a dark room for a day. He just set up and did dark room. And I was like, good for you, dude. And it was horribly uncomfortable, of course. But that's how you do it. So I would say stillness and then suffering. Like, one of the best things you can do is get your body moving. So especially if you're in a rut, go do hard exercise. Exercise is not going to solve the life problems that you have, but it will give you stronger internal weapons to navigate and fight those life problems. So it's one of the best things you can do for mind, body, spirit. It's literally my salvation. It's how I found peace when I was in the throes of depression and addiction and PTSD, right? So starting with, especially if you're like, let's say overweight or something, go for a 1 kilometer walk, right? That'll then expand to 2 and 3 and so on and so forth. So do some exercise, take some time, like suffering and stillness. Suffering, stillness, and I'd say the third mechanism there is social. So if you look at the 3 S's, suffering, stillness, social, is put yourself in environments with people who don't think like you. Many people stay in a rut because they're in the same environment. Go, and how do you do this? Go to a seminar. Go to, like, for example, my wife. We've now been married 6 months. We've been dating 6 months. We just got married a week and a half ago. And
oh, you just got married?
Just got married, yeah.
Congratulations, Akshay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, just got married. Like,
you guys got married in Alaska?
Oh,
you did. Okay. That's fantastic.
But like cold tubs and saunas and
yeah,
things like that. So you're putting yourself in a room where you're finding other high-vibe people who are seeking evolution in some way, or like listening to podcasts like this, because now you're going to hear an idea that you didn't know before. That's how you start to even recognize what you don't know, because you, me, every single one of us, we don't know what we don't know. So we're all in some version of our own prison of our own reality, right? To even start to figure out what the bars of those prisons look like, you got to start putting yourself in rooms where you start to figure out what you don't know. And then you're like, oh, now I know that this is what I don't know. Got it. Now I can start addressing it, right? So suffering, stillness, and social. Put yourself in some version of those 3, and you'll start to, will it be easy? It will not. You'll feel possibly some imposter syndrome. I've felt it when I've gone into rooms like that. If you have social anxiety, you'll feel some of that. The stillness will be daunting. I truly believe, like Blaise Pascal said, that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit by himself alone. I think stillness is one of humanity's greatest fears. It's not a fear people will, like, if you ask them, what are you scared of? Almost nobody will say stillness. But if you look at our world, we do everything we can to distract ourselves from ourselves, whether it be drinking, phones, Netflix, whatever it may be. We do everything to distract ourselves from ourselves. So sit still with yourself and then go suffer physically, because when you suffer physically taps into mind, body, spirit all at once, right? You'll go into the places where you don't want to be, but that's where you need to be, because when one part of you wants to fight and the other wants to quit, that's when in that little internal conflict, in that battle, you'll start to find some evolution.
I really appreciate you sharing that as concretely as you did, because I get that question all the time. Well, what should I do? What should I do? And I'm just going to cut this little snippet out and say, hear it from Akshay, because you can, it was just so concise. You have to acknowledge it, suffer, stillness, and then social. And I think that piece is, again, the reason and I'll say me, all of us, at many points in our life, don't put ourselves in uncomfortable situations is because we're afraid of it and we don't
Yeah.
like that feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and you just outlined it perfectly.
Thank you.
Jumping to Antarctica, what would you say to someone that says, yeah, he's doing that because he's lost and he's trying to find himself, or he's just crazy? What would you say to someone who thinks like that?
So, for one, this is certainly not doing it to run away or trying to find a self, because I've done that. Like when I did Greenland, I very know concretely know what that's like, and I get it. People say I'm crazy all the time, dude. You can imagine. I get some flavor of that all the time. You're crazy. What's wrong with you?
Hey, and there's nothing wrong with being crazy, right?
Okay, like if that's what you want to ascribe to me, that's okay, but I think when people hear the deeper why behind it, they get it. It's not a running away. It's not even, because I also don't believe there's an inherent self to find. There's a self to create. We're all malleable, and we dance on this human experience. And so I'm going seeking to find new, like I've been blessed with a tremendous amount of life experience in my 39 years, played on tons of edges, seen the depths of darkness and light, both within and without, and I've touched a lot of that, that hand of God. I've experienced the human soul, but until the day we die, there's always more growth to be had. There's always more light to experience. There's always more service to be given, and so I go in search of that unearthed treasures, because this will be deeper than I've ever gone before. I mean,
Yeah.
that level of solitude, that level of struggle. So I will inevitably, I mean, I know I was just in the Arctic earlier this year. I was on a series of solar expeditions out there. And whenever I'm out there, I experience what I call quote unquote spiritual downloads, when I get these insights that hit in a visceral way, not just a conceptual way, but a visceral way, like a knowing, not a thought, a knowing. And I can't wait to see what I will find, to unearth in the treasures of the human spirit. So it's what I seek, and I think we are all explorers in some way. I mean, from the moment a child is born, they're exploring the world with curiosity, and I invite people to tap into that more. Be curious, like when you hear something that triggers you. We coming back to the point we talked about earlier. Instead of judging it, like for example, this made me think about this. My wife and I have said, and we've said this publicly, we will never fight. We don't fight, and we never will fight. And I can't tell you how many people got triggered by this like crazy. Like, that's Akshay's just crazy, Akshay's naive, whatever, right? Or they're stupid, they don't know what they're talking about. Now, if you have that initial judgment, it's okay. We don't control what our initial response to external stimuli is. But then instead of like trying to put your own constructs onto this dude's just crazy, be curious. Because in that curiosity, you'll learn, you'll grow. So I go into Antarctica with curiosity to see what I will find, who I will become on the other side of this journey, and what treasures I can then bring back into my human family. And I think
You haven't, yeah, and I resonate with what you're saying a lot, just in some of my own past experiences. Certainly nothing to the extreme that you're going, and quite frankly, I'm a little bit envious, because I can imagine the hustle and bustle and fakeness of society. And again, I'm generalizing. There's a lot of authentic people, but you understand what I'm saying, and our listeners do as well. To have the opportunity to be in an environment that is extremely harsh, I mean, just and nothingness. I think that it's going to just be very powerful, real powerful. And so what I want to ask you, and then we'll have to talk once you're done. You obviously don't know, but what are your expectations of what you may learn or find, or what the experience is going to be like?
I mean, I have a sense of what the experience will be like, because I've done a lot of polar travel before. This will be magnified because I've never gone that long and that far alone. So in that sense, I haven't, I know what's coming. That's why I train for it. But as far as in the deeper sense, I genuinely have no expectations, and that's part of it. Like, people have asked, what will you do after this? Who will you beat on the other side of this? And my genuine answer is, I don't know. But that's the draw. Like, I can't wait to see what I will discover. And will I go through hard times? Of course, man. Like, that's the nature of it. There'll be many lonely moments, many hard moments, and many beautiful moments where you feel all connected. Like, some of my most connected moments have been in these experiences, kind of paradoxically, even though you're pure alone. And that's why I love these playgrounds. You get to feel oneness. As an example, in Antarctica, you feel very small. It is so humbling. The might of nature's fury in this epic, massive playground, right? And these forces hammering you like hurricane force winds hitting you. But so you feel so small and humble, but you also feel so all powerful that you're even in that playground, and you
Yeah.
feel so mighty. So nature is this magnificent playground to feel these dualities that we talked about all coexisting as one. You see the lows and the highs, the summits and the valleys. And because when nature acts out of hostility, like when the force of nature, there's no intent to it. It's not with malice, right? Like what human beings do evil to each other. And so that becomes the isness of nature becomes a mirror for the human soul. It becomes a mirror for you to see yourself, right? And that ability to see the dualities coexisting as one, it is oneness. It's enlightenment, or whatever word you want to use. And what that will do to me, what I will find, I don't know, brother, but I'm very curious.
Yeah, I am as well. And I think it'll be, even though you've had the experience, because you're taking it to such an extreme,
Yeah.
it's going to be real interesting to see what you discover. And, when you talk about the frailty of man, I've experienced that as a scuba diver. You're
Yeah.
in the ocean and
Yeah.
just, I remember the first time I saw a shark probably 20 feet away. It was the most powerful and crazy experience, because in 2 seconds I could have been dead.
Yeah.
But it's what you just described. And for those who haven't put themselves in a situation to feel that minusculity of man,
Yeah.
do it, find it, because again, for me, that screams nothing, especially nature is the almightiness of God.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's why it's so incredibly powerful. What does your wife think about this?
When we met, I was actually scheduled to go to Antarctica this or last year in 2023. I would have been there right now as we speak. It got moved to next year for different reasons. So, in some sense, she knew what she was getting into. She knew what I was getting into, and she understands the spirituality of it. She gets it. She's very supportive. Inevitably, she's nervous. I'm gone for quite a while. I mean, beyond
Yeah.
4 months in Antarctica. I'm doing 1 month solo in Iceland. I'm going to do another month expedition in Greenland. So in our first year of marriage, I'm gone for about 6 months of it to be doing these things. So it's hard, but she's very, very supportive. She gets the why behind it, which there is a deeper why. It's a very spiritual pursuit for me, these things. And she gets that. She sees the impact it makes when I talk about it, when I share it. And I've had so many people, like people who've heard me speak and then like lost all this weight and hiked Everest Base Camp, and it touches people's soul, like, and through other stories that have touched mine. So that I don't say this in an egotistical way, because we're all bigger than each individual self here, and so the stories that I'm able to share through these journeys leave a mark. And so she does worry, but she's very supportive, and I couldn't
Yeah.
do that without her support. She like will help me lift bags of snow into my sled here in Alaska. She'll be shoveling snow. She's a savage in her own way, and very supportive of this madness.
That's fantastic. Well, and once you're done with the journey, you guys can go on an incredible honeymoon and share that experience.
Absolutely.
You've been very gracious with your time, Akshay. So I just got a few more questions for you. You've talked to corporations across the world and, in front of a lot of crowds, talking about this idea of embracing fear, adversity, struggles. And that's where you find some you learn a lot about yourself and personal growth. What are some of the most interesting questions that you've been asked as you've spoken in front of multiple crowds?
Funny thing about this question is usually when I'm in these conversations or a speech, I'm in such flow. Like even after a podcast interview like this one, my wife will often ask me what questions you ask. I'm like, I can't remember.
I've been there before, so I certainly.
Right? Yeah. So forgive me if I'm not answering it great, but I think it's just I guess sometimes with kids it's really funny. I mean, I've spoken to young kids; they ask really interesting questions too. Like they even asked, like, in a funny enough, my first time I got the question on my polar trips is, "What do you think about?" And adults never asked that, but the kids were very insightful to see that. Like actually, the greatest challenge is what do you do with your mind while you're standing around or walking slowly for and walking very slowly for 12 hours a day. So that was an interesting one that I got from a kid. And then, I get more like sometimes practical questions and some of the more deeper spiritual questions. Even when I'm tire dragging in parks in Arizona, because I have a heavy tire that I drag for my training, I get stopped and asked all kinds of questions about what I'm doing, about why, and things like that. So,
What is the answer when the kid asked you, or even now I'll ask you, what do you think about when you're in the midst of one of these, and mountaineering is very different
yeah,
because as you described, you're on a heightened sense of alert, you're all present,
yeah,
you're focused, but in these vast wilderness of incredibleness, and there's really not a lot to see or think about.
yeah.
Um, Sidebar: are there polar bears and stuff in Antarctica, or any type of wildlife that you have to be concerned about, or is it so desolate that that's not even a concern?
No, polar bears are only in the Arctic. In
Okay,
Antarctica, there's only penguins in one corner of Antarctica, but 90% plus of Antarctica has no wildlife at all. No life.
okay, so that's you don't have to get worried about
Worry about
getting
that.
mauled
Exactly.
by anything.
Exactly.
Um, but in those moments, what do you think about?
You're like literally everything. I mean, your mind has the luxury and the burden to go everywhere it can possibly go. In the last few years, when I was single, it was often the desire to be in a relationship. Like there was the loneliness around it. Like, desire
Yeah,
for that, thinking about life, thinking about my work, thinking about God, thinking about myself, my journey, who I want to be. And sometimes you have those moments where you're just in pure stillness and there is no thought and you're just in the isness of that experience, in the here and now. Sometimes the battle is constantly bringing yourself back into the here and now. When sometimes you're thinking about how much this sucks and you're waiting for this to end.
I was going to ask, do you ever think about what the heck am I doing?
Yep, you go through moments where you're like one on a shift, because I ski in these 75-minute shifts. And sometimes you're like, oh, when is your shift going to end? But those moments, it's a perfect opportunity to bring yourself back into the here and now and remember that there's a reason you're here. And often it's a lot of gratitude, deep gratitude that I get to be in. It's a privilege to get to experience the things that I get to experience. Sometimes it's tapping into the darkness, like using every weapon in the internal arsenal of, sometimes it's light, like of the gratitude, of love, of peace. And sometimes it's dark. Sometimes it's thinking about the guilt. It's thinking about the war. It's thinking about the hell on earth, and using that as fuel, this debt that I owe for my life, So you go into every internal weapon you can find to navigate the quote unquote pain cave, as I like to call it, that internal place, especially when you're deep in the suck of it, just navigating that pain cave. And there's many, through all the things that I've done over the past, I've developed many different internal tools to navigate the pain cave. And sometimes I'm listening to music to kind of escape,
Yeah,
very, very
yeah,
openly to escape. And sometimes escaping is not the answer. So you're doing
yeah.
these two things that, again, could be opposites, that in many ways are exact opposites, escaping versus being with fully, but both have their place. And the key is knowing when to access which comes from practice, which is what I've done and why I'm here in Alaska training.
Yeah, and to your point, I think that living in that pain cave is likely where the most personal growth comes from because it allows you to get to that next step of wandering and experiencing
Yeah.
some powerful and incredible thoughts and just being present in that vast wilderness.
Yeah.
Akshay, is there anything else that you want to share with our viewers and listeners that we haven't already talked about?
I think yeah, one final thing to maybe kind of tie a ribbon on everything we've been speaking about is from Buddha, wiser man than myself. Buddha once said, "We're all stabbed by the two darts of suffering. The first dart is the one we don't control. So if I'm in a room right now, somebody comes in with the gun, I'm going to feel fear. We talked about earlier how we don't control the initial response to external stimuli, right? I'm not choosing to feel fear. My brain will react. The second dart is, what do I do with that fear? So in the example of, let's say, writing my book, I feel fear. Got it. I'm not choosing it. It happened in response to this desire to write a book. The second dart is, what's wrong with me? Why do I feel this? Why do bad things happen to me? We go down that stories that we go down our head, go into, right, into our head, that I call the spiraling of second dart syndrome. And if there's one thing to take away from all of this, the way to move through, to do all the things we talked about, from stillness, suffering, and social, to dealing with the internal emotions that are more challenging, not negative, that are more challenging than the other ones, like fear, stress, anxiety, is to pause, recognize the first dart from the second dart, and master that space. That space between the first and the second dart will define your destiny. So when you see yourself, and I've worked with a client, for example, who would have anxiety every time he tried to get on a computer to write, and he would feel massive then judgment around the anxiety. And he'd be like, what's wrong with me? Literally his internal dialogue, right? Like, why should I feel this? So he would run to watch TV to numb itself out. And everybody would try to help him get rid of the anxiety. And my whole thing was, we don't control right now. The goal is not to get rid of the anxiety. In time, we can shift the first start response. But right now, we don't have control over it. It's just your brain has created in a simplistic way. Computer equals anxiety. So we're just going to pause, notice the self-dialogue, then just write for 30 seconds, then 1 minute, then 2 minutes, so on and so forth, till we build a new pattern. But the point is to master that space, to be with the first start of the emotion that you're experiencing, and then release the story around it, release the second darts, release the dialogue you go into, and translate it into purposeful action that will help you become that version of you that you seek.
Akshay, this has been a really incredible conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time today, and we look forward to following you on your journey. Again, people can help support you. You're trying to raise $750,000, all of it going to the journey, none of it going to you personally at fearvana.com. I think you've raised $204,000 thus far. I'm confident you'll reach that goal by the time your journey starts in November of 2024. Thank you so much for joining the Andrew Holland podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
What a truly fascinating conversation with Akshay and his mindset of finding that peace between suffering and the response, and pushing yourself physically, mentally, as he would describe spiritually, to a different level by going, for him, it's his expedition in Antarctica, and thinking about being solo for 110 days and traversing over 1,700 miles through really the barrenness of what Antarctica has to offer. I think there's a lot to be learned or thought about in that particular situation. And so I would ask you, he talked about and gave his advice on getting out of the monotony of life. And for me, just the concept of going 1,700 miles across Antarctica, I just zero desire to do it. And I'm impressed on all the training and effort he's putting forward. But that's, for him, how he's going to take his mind and his 10x, if you will, to the next personal growth step. What is your Antarctica? What are you working towards that's a struggle, or that's really embracing that fear or adversity and using it to your motivation? And I think that's his whole concept or point of Fearvana, is don't let those emotions dictate negativity, but use those, what are typically considered negative emotions. And he, of course, talks about there's no good or bad emotions. They're just emotions, and how you use them is what's in your control. What are you doing? What is your Antarctica to take that next level of personal growth? And if you're stuck in that monotony, I think what he talked about, what is the fear? If that's what's stopping you, accept it, acknowledge it, think about it, then put yourself in a dark room in the stillness and just let your thoughts be what your thoughts are, and then find those social connections. And I think that's one of the things that we all struggle with as humans, is finding different circumstances or atmospheres that make us feel uncomfortable. But that's really, and I've talked to so many entrepreneurs, where you find the most growth, when you put yourself in uncomfortable situations. So if there's anything that we can take away from this, and there's a lot to take away from what Akshay shared with us, but how frequently are you putting yourself in uncomfortable situations because you're afraid of that fear? And if you're not, do it and see how much you personally grow. So thankful for Akshay for sharing his experience. Of course, if you want to support what he's trying to do in going across Antarctica, something no other human has done, solo skiing all by himself, go to fearvana.com. He has a particular tab that's on Antarctica, a whole video describing what he's doing, why he's doing. He shared that with us today. And if you're so inclined, he's got different levels of donation opportunities for you to help support the cause. That's all the time that we have for this week's episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. Thank you so much for joining or watching every single week. Please subscribe to the Andrew Holland Podcast on YouTube so you get the updates every week when we post the video version, Or if you prefer to listen to the podcast, please subscribe to the channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast, on your favorite audio platform, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your other podcasts. Follow me on Twitter, Holland Podcast. Always enjoy the interaction between us, you as the listener, and me, and I can talk with guests or connect you with guests that way. It's a great way for us to interact. That's all the time that we have for this week's episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk again next week. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, Holland Podcast. That's Holland Podcast, for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.